We are now in the aspect 4 of Desjardins chapter 2 of his introduction to business of ethics. And we are moving on to ethics of principles. And so the important question is the first one. What is the importance of freedom in the ethics of principle? We've seen previously how ethics of consequences work based on the notion of pleasure and pain and equality of each person's happiness and suffering. But how do ethics of principle work? The claim here is that it works on the basis of the notion of freedom. Kantianism is the philosophy that articulates this ethics of principles based on the notion of freedom, named after a German philosopher, Immanuel Kant. And finally, the theme we should be looking out for is treating human freedom as an end in itself, not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. And human freedom comes to mean roughly the same thing as rationality and choice. There's an aspect 4 here, which is that of criticism of Kantianism. And so we will look at that as well. Let's go into it. Ethics of principles concerns itself with respect for humanity of each human being as an absolute, unchanging, and inexchangeable value. In other words, humanity is to be respected in principle, regardless of consequences. If respecting humanity leads to lots and lots of suffering, we should still respect humanity. If respecting humanity leads to lots and lots of happiness, well, that doesn't actually add to the value of respecting humanity. Respecting humanity has its value in itself, as an end in itself, as it were. All right, so the whole thing here is just how do we do ethics of principle? Is there anything that we can say is good in principle, regardless of consequences? Freedom is the answer that comes to mind. All right, let's do this passage one more time. Ethics of principles concerns itself with respect for humanity in each human being as an absolute, unchanging, and inexchangeable value. Unlike in the case of ethics of consequences, where the value of everything changes depending on the consequences it produces, right? The basic value that constitutes humanity is freedom. Freedom is made possible by that we are rational beings, defined by that each person chooses for themselves, which is what we call autonomy. Freedom and autonomy is what makes us human. And we are only free and autonomous due to that we are rational beings. As rational beings, we present options to ourselves and think about which options we should choose. There we are exercising rationality, and there we would also be exercising our freedom in making that choice. Not a very unusual thing to say that what makes human beings special and worthy of respect is our rationality. And what our rationality ultimately means is that we present ourselves with options and we choose between those options. And each individual makes who they are by making their choices, So respect for individuals, for human beings, comes to mean respect for their rational choice. The thought here is that if one does not choose rationally, if one chooses merely at random, or if one simply goes with whatever one feels like, there isn't really freedom exercised there. One is controlled by one's feelings, or one is simply choosing at random. What freedom is there, right? So rationality, freedom, humanity, all of these, and choice, all of these hang together. And it's what's captured in the notion of autonomy. Let me do this chapter one more time. Let me do this passage one more time in light of everything I just mentioned. Ethics of principles concerns itself with respect for humanity of each human being as an absolute, unchanging, and inexchangeable value that must be respected in principle, regardless of consequences. The basic value that constitutes humanity is freedom. Freedom is made possible by that we are rational beings, defined by that each person makes choices for themselves. Each person chooses who they are. And that is what we mean by autonomy. Freedom and autonomy is what makes us human. When we ask about what is right in principle, independent of consequences of an action, we mean to discuss that each human being's choice of what to do and how to live must be respected and, this is key, not manipulated or violated, right? To respect someone's freedom is to not manipulate. Even if respecting choices of persons causes suffering to them, out of respect for their freedom as rational beings, we should not coerce or manipulate their choices. We are discussing a basic school of morals that is not utilitarianism and that takes all of the above seriously. Remember, for utilitarianism, the fundamental human value which it furthers is that of happiness. Here, the fundamental human value in the principle of, in the ethics of principle that is furthered is that of freedom. Freedom is not good due to its consequences, but it's good in itself, in principle. We're discussing a basic school of morals that is not utilitarianism and that takes all of the above seriously. It claims that nothing matters more for human beings than their freedom. Capacity for freedom is what makes us into human beings in general, and each individual human being into who they are. One more time. Capacity for freedom is what makes us into human beings in general, unlike our four-legged animal friends who simply go with their feelings and instincts and reflexes and so on. And each individual human being becomes what they are due to their exercise of their freedom. Each of us is an individual that we are due to the choices that we make for ourselves. Thus, a morally good action is one that respects humanity as freedom of each human being. That is what makes this thinking about freedom into moral thinking. It is impartial and objective in that sense. Each human being's freedom matters equally. Not just the freedom of people I like, not that my freedom matters more than anyone else's, but freedom as such and freedom of each individual human being matter equally. That's the impartiality part. And freedom as a fundamental human purpose that is being furthered here is the furthering fundamental human purpose part of morality. Remember the two parts of what makes theory into a theory of morality is that it must further some fundamental human person, some fundamental human purpose, in this case, freedom, and it must do so impartially. Each person's freedom matters equally. The school of thought that subscribes to the above is Kantianism, articulated by a German philosopher in the middle of the 19th century, Immanuel Kant. A moral action on the Kantian account is the one that respects freedom or autonomy of each human being as an end to itself. That is to say, moral action never treats the freedom or autonomy or choices of human beings as a means to an end, such as would be the case if we were to manipulate someone. There we are treating their choices as a means to our own ends. But to treat freedom of a person as an end in itself is to treat their choices as an end in itself, not simply as a means to our ends. Thus, on a Kantian account, slavery or child labor are immoral. They do not treat the freedom or autonomy or choice of human beings as an end in itself. Remember, the problem with utilitarianism was that it could justify child labor or slavery as long as the majority is benefited by the few. Here, every person's freedom matters equally and is not exchangeable. So there is not going to be anything like tyranny of majority over that of minority that seems to become possible under utilitarianism. One more time. Thus, on a Kantian account, slavery or child labor are immoral. They do not treat the freedom or autonomy or choice of human beings as an end in itself. No one would choose to be a slave, and so their freedom, autonomy, or choice is not respected. Children are not old enough to choose for themselves and are not free or autonomous. Respecting freedom as an end in itself requires facilitation, one more time. Respecting freedom as an end in itself in children requires facilitation of rationality and choice in children by education, rather than robbing them of that opportunity and putting them to work. No slavery, no child labor could be justified by principles of ethics. That is Kantianism. In the business context, we would say that a business operates morally on the Kantian account if its actions respect the choice or freedom or autonomy of all persons as a matter of principle. Notably, it is the intentions of actions, whether the doer intends to respect each person as an end in itself, and not the consequences that make actions moral or immoral. Even if I produce beneficial consequences, I am maximizing someone's happiness, but I'm not really addressing their freedom. So in that sense, freedom is properly treated from the standpoint of intentions, not that of consequences. One more time. Notably, it is the intentions of actions and not the consequences that make actions moral or immoral if freedom is our value. On to criticism of Kantianism. Criticism of Kant comes from utilitarians. Is freedom really the highest value in the morals and the basis of morals, utilitarians would say? Utilitarians propose that Kantians have got it all wrong. Rationality and freedom are a means to happiness and are not an end in itself. On the utilitarian line, freedom can be sacrificed for happiness, as it is only a means to happiness. As an aside, we could mention that utilitarians could institute something like individual rights and protections of freedom, if that is required for maximization of happiness of the populace. A utilitarian would argue that the possibility of slavery would create more harm than benefits for everyone in a society. People would live in constant fear that they may be made into slaves or violated in some other way at any moment that would benefit the collective. Right? So perhaps happiness could be raised by protecting of each person's freedom, but the whole point of Kantianism and ethics of principles is that freedom is valuable in itself, and we respect it, not simply because it makes us happy to do so, but because there is something deeply right and human and fundamentally human about freedom.